So Donald Trump is now the president of the United States, which means he has a lot of things to focus on from his agenda, from mass deportations to imposing tariffs to even maybe taking Greenland. It's a long list of goals and items on his list that he needs to get done. But to get any of it through, he's going to need a large team of people to help him get his things achieved. But as we've covered here on the Ishaan S show previously, some of the people Trump has been picking are, let's say, unique. People with all sorts of interesting backgrounds, from Fox News hosts to people that have shot their own dogs. And so we here at the Ishaan S show are going to do some of the heavy lifting for you and introduce you to the men and women who are going to make decisions about your life every single day. We'll talk about notable moments from their careers, their backgrounds, and stuff any ordinary person probably wouldn't want their boss to know about. This is an Ishaan S show miniseries, Meet the Trump Administration. So for our first episode today, we are going to talk about the Department of Homeland Security. It's a cabinet-level department, and it was created after the 9/11 attacks. And I'm going to give you some quick fast facts about the Department of Homeland Security, so let's get ready. It's a cabinet-level department, like I said. It's responsible for protecting people like you and me from all sorts of threats, from terrorism to natural disasters. They have 240,000 employees. They oversee agencies that you might be familiar with, like FEMA and Border Patrol, and they have a $97 billion budget. So they're a pretty expansive and large department, and they're relatively new when it comes to the scene of cabinet-level departments. But yeah, whoever sits there, they have a lot of responsibility. Now, the interesting Trump spin on all of this is that during his first term as president, DHS had one of the highest turnover rates of any other cabinet-level department when it came to the cabinet secretaries in the Trump administration. That means that he was flushing through a lot of them. In fact, during his 4 years as president, Trump had 6 secretaries of Homeland Security. Some of them were acting, some of them were appointed, but 6 different people held that job. Trump has a lot of feelings about whoever sits in that role. So, it's a lot of people. And I guess in a Trump administration, if you were the Secretary of Homeland Security, you were probably more likely to get fired than my friend at McDonald's is. But I digress. So that brings us to our topic for today's Meet the Trump Administration edition, which is Trump's latest pick to run that department, and that would be Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota. Kristi Noem is no stranger to this show. I have covered her extensively, and I'm pretty sure she's been a part of this show, like in terms of my coverage, since probably the start. You might recall, early listeners of the show might recall that I even touted Governor Noem as a rising star in the Republican Party, and not to toot my own horn, but she has been a big part of Republican politics for the past 4 or 5 years. Even in COVID, she made quite the name for herself. We'll talk about that later, though. But now, even if you are tuning into the Ishaan S show for the first time and you don't know anything about politics, you don't know anything about Republican politics, you see Kristi Noem's face and you might think like, gee, that face looks really familiar for some reason. Why do I know her? For those of you that did know that that's the governor of South Dakota, bonus points for you, but I bet a lot more of you probably know her as the lady who shot her own dog. Yeah, that brings us to story number 1 about Kristi Noem, which is that in her memoir, No Going Back, which was published in 2024, Noem, on her own admission, said that she shot her puppy named Cricket. Did I mention that this was a memoir that she wrote on her own about her own life, and so she could choose the facts that she included? When detailing the incident in her memoir, she wrote, quote, "I realized I had to put her down. I hated that dog." Yikes. According to Noem, Cricket was untrainable, and that Cricket was out of control most of the time. But don't worry, shooting the dog was never the first step for Noem. She had other things that she did before that, and one of those things was using an electric collar. Unfortunately, the electric collar was not as effective as Kristi Noem would have liked, and it was only after Cricket actually killed a neighbor's chicken, because don't forget, in South Dakota, people have chickens as pets. But it was only after Cricket killed a chicken in the neighbor's yard, and then Cricket threatened Noem herself, that she decided that she had had enough. And so she dragged Cricket to a gravel pit somewhere on the property, took out her gun, and shot the dog. Anyway, rest in peace, Cricket. But it didn't stop at Cricket. It actually goes further. In that same exercise, Noem details then that there was a goat on her property. She described the goat as being, quote, nasty and mean, and also decided that she had to take the goat out. With the goat, it took more than one shot, but she did eventually kill the goat as well. Through this whole whatever, there's a lot of confusion as to why Noem even decided to include something like this in her memoir. It's weird, to say the least, and there's some reason to believe that she included this in her book because she wanted to make a name for herself among right-wing circles. I don't know if that necessarily worked out. It was also at the same time she was being touted as a top candidate to be Donald Trump's vice president. And I guess she must have seen 2 and 2 releasing the memoir. She decided to include this story to maybe boost her name. I don't know. But you tell me, if I was the governor of South Dakota and I was on the short list to be a vice president, maybe I wouldn't include a story admitting to killing a helpless puppy. But then again, I'm not the governor of South Dakota, and I'm not running to be vice president. But Donald Trump did agree with me, and he was actually reportedly really repulsed by this. And Donald Trump is notoriously not very fond of dogs. So you can understand what it might have taken for Trump to be repulsed by the story. And people say that it ultimately cost Kristi Noem the vice presidency. So right now we have a Vice President J.D. Vance, and that's maybe in part because of the passing of Cricket the dog. Of course, she didn't really cut the chops to be vice president, but I guess Secretary of Homeland Security, she was a better pick. Gotcha. Anyway, that is story number 1 about Kristi Noem. Story number 2 also comes from her book, No Going Back. This one is not a murderous admission. Hopefully, I'm glad to hear that. But this is indeed about one of her experiences as a congresswoman, and actually goes into her experiences with foreign policy, or lack thereof. And this, in this part of the book, Noem details an interesting encounter she had during a foreign trip. And in that foreign trip, she, as a congresswoman, talked about her meeting with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Yeah. So when I remember Donald Trump met Kim Jong-un, we made such a fanfare about it, and everybody was talking about it. Why? Because most of the time, you don't see U.S. government officials meeting with North Korean ones. But Kristi Noem was the exception, and she met with Kim Jong-un. She even wrote about it in her memoir. And I'll read you the quote. She said, quote, "I remember when I met with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. I'm sure he underestimated me, having no clue about my experience staring down little tyrants. I'd been a children's pastor after all." She was a children's pastor after all. She knew what she was doing. Now, I don't need to tell you guys this with much evidence, but it is a fact that this did not happen. It just didn't. And this was first reported by the Dakota Scout, and then other news organizations picked up on this story. But it was ultimately, it was fake, and it wasn't a real thing that happened. And there's no proof in congressional records. Staffers testified, and they all said that this was a fake story. And after this came out, just a few days before No Going Back was going to be published, a spokesperson said that the story shouldn't have been included and that that specific anecdote in the book would be, quote, adjusted. It's just funny. It's funny that she even thought of including a story like this in her own book, which wasn't even real and people wouldn't know. I don't know. But she was a children's pastor after all, so dealing with little kids, like, that was her specialty. Anyway, here's Kristi Noem and her own explanation of this very unique story.
I'm saying that this book is very, very good, and I've met with many world leaders, and that there are world leaders that I've met with that are in this book. There are many that I've met with that are not in this book. Okay. And this is an anecdote that I asked to have removed because I think it's appropriate at this point in time. But I'm not going to talk to you about those personal meetings that I've had with world leaders. Okay. I'm just not going to have that conversation because I think it's important.
That's quite the interview. You can watch the whole thing. It's on YouTube somewhere on CBS's Face the Nation. It's interesting because throughout that entire interview, there was not a single definitive point where Kristi Noem could say she did or did not meet Kim Jong-un. And I don't know, if I was in a position to meet Kim Jong-un, I'm pretty sure I would remember it and I would rightfully include it in my memoir, but I guess not. Anyway, that is story number 2. Story number 3 has to do with her handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of you will recall in 2020, we were all shut down. We all had to stay home, and it was because as we understand science, viruses spread easier when we are collected and in big groups. And that is why governors across the country were shutting down their states. But not Kristi Noem. No. Governor Noem was unique in her thinking, and in her own words, she did not believe in any sort of restrictions. She believed on having a strong emphasis on personal responsibility and minimal government intervention. And it's in this doctrine of hers that she refused to shut down the state of South Dakota. At CPAC, she would even she proudly touted that South Dakota was the only state that didn't have a mask mandate, that didn't shut down or ever have a shelter-in-place order. Scream it from the mountaintops, Governor Noem. So she was number one in a sense, but there have been a few instances during the COVID-19 pandemic that have tarnished her name in terms of her handling, including the Sturgis motorcycle rally that happened in August of 2020. So while you and I were at home, stuck at home, we were forced to not see our families because we understood that we didn't want to give them COVID or risk getting it ourselves. Kristi Noem allowed for this rally to happen, and so in South Dakota, there were hundreds of thousands of people gathered and for this rally, and it was one of the biggest events and collections of people in 2020. And as a result, there was a huge uptick in COVID-19 cases in the state of South Dakota. Another example is the meatpacking incident, where a meatpacking company saw huge cases because of Noem's own policies, where she refused to shut down many businesses, and she even refused to shut down that meatpacking plant. They saw huge cases of COVID-19, and only after that huge uptick did she and the mayor of Sioux Falls ultimately try to pressure this company to shut down. Kristi Noem, I guess it's a better note of her judgment, maybe, that she allowed for all of this to happen. But I'll read you a quick stat. So in her state of 919,000 people between 2020 and 2022, her state saw 200,000 people get COVID. Number one in a sense, but here's something else. At one point, her state was the global capital of per capita COVID-19 deaths in the world. I mean, if she wanted to shine in one sense, she was shining for sure in this one. But that's story number 3. Story number 4 is a bit more of a unique story, and this is a bit more of a personal one, I guess. It involves Noem, her daughter, the Secretary of Labor, and portions of the government of South Dakota, and real estate. I'll explain. So in July of 2020, Noem's daughter Cassidy was applying to be a real estate appraiser, and in July of 2020, she received a notice from the South Dakota Appraiser Certification Program that said that her application was en route for denial. And that was only because she failed the test twice. And in South Dakota, you only get 2 chances to take that test before you fail, and then you can't get the license. But of course, just a week later, Noem, Cassidy, the Secretary of Labor, and the director of the South Dakota Real Estate Appraisers License Certification Program were all in the governor's mansion for a quick meeting. And they all sat down to discuss Cassidy's application. Anyway, it was discussed in detail, and ultimately, after giving it a lot of thought, these people managed to find a very unprecedented and historic 3rd opportunity for Cassidy to take this test. And lo and behold, by November of 2020, she was actually found to be she was in 2020 awarded that license. So yay, Cassidy. But obviously, foul play, preferential treatment was accused of happening, and so the Republican-controlled South Dakota legislature launched a probe into this whole episode to investigate what happened, and they interviewed Sherry Brand, the director of the program, and she described this meeting as, quote, she felt during this meeting, she said she was, quote, intimidated during this meeting, where things were discussed in detail. The Secretary of Labor was found to have a very hands-on approach to Cassidy's application. And ultimately, Bren, who had been leading this department since 1991, was forced to retire as a result of her following the law, following federal standards. I don't know. Kristi Noem, of course, after the South Dakota legislature found that there was preferential treatment, she refuted this. And obviously, I understand where she's coming from. Like, if my mom was the governor of South Dakota, obviously I would try to have her abuse her power and make something happen for me, of course. But while we were celebrating Cassidy's, award of the license, unfortunately, she had to give up the license because after a while, she didn't want to take the toxic, overbearing scrutiny of all the accusations of preferential treatment that were later found to be true. So unfortunately, she had to go. So she gave up this hard-sought license, and now she does not do real estate appraising anymore. That's story number 4 about Kristi Noem. So Kristi Noem is going to be the Secretary of Homeland Security. We've watched her confirmation hearings, and by the time this comes out, she may even be confirmed. I don't know. This is being recorded on Sunday. But whatever it is, she will probably be the next Secretary of Homeland Security, and she's going to be a very powerful woman. So I hope that some of these stories take you into her psychology, take you into some of her thinking, and maybe shine a light on some of the stuff that she's done in her past. All of the stories, I'm pretty sure, all of the stories come from her time as governor, and I'm pretty sure, and except for the fabricated story about Kim Jong-un. But yeah, that is a bit about Homeland Security Secretary nominee, or maybe confirmed, Kristi Noem in this first installment of Meet the Trump Administration. If you liked my commentary, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Spotify if you're listening to us there. Check out the IshaanSshow.com. Follow us on social media. And join me next Tuesday as we take a look at Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. I'll see you then. Thanks for joining us.